I've watched qualified candidates eliminate themselves from jobs they could have gotten. They read the job description, count up several requirements they meet, and three they don't, and they close the browser. They assume they're not qualified. But here's what most people don't understand about how job descriptions actually work. They aren't checklists. They are wish lists. And the people doing the hiring know that. This happens constantly. You see a security analyst position that looks interesting, you read through the requirements. 5 years of experience and you have three. Splunk experience and you've only used QRadar. Python and you know PowerShell. You think you're wasting their time by applying, so you don't. But you may be eliminating yourself from a job where you'd actually be the strongest candidate they see. So how job descriptions get written? Let me explain. How they actually get created. Because understanding this changes how you should read them. They rarely come from one person sitting down carefully defining what's truly required. Instead, they come from committees. HR pulls up the template. The hiring manager mentions they love someone who knows Terraform. HR adds it as a requirement. The person leaving the role use ServiceNow, so that gets listed. A senior leader once said Python would be useful for automation. Add it to the list. Nothing ever gets removed because taking things off feels like you're lowering your standards. What you end up with is a document listing everything the team currently uses, everything they wish they had, and, well, everything that might possibly be useful someday. The result is a job description for a perfect candidate who probably doesn't exist and definitely isn't required for someone to do the job successfully. Many hiring managers will tell you privately they'd be thrilled to find someone who meets 70% of what's actually posted. So there's a gap between what gets posted and who actually gets hired. And that gap creates opportunity if you understand how to evaluate your own qualifications honestly. The cybersecurity unemployment rate has been near zero for years. Security positions stay open for months. Eventually, employers face a choice: keep waiting for the perfect candidate or hire someone strong who can grow into the role. Most choose the second option. And this isn't settling. It's recognizing that someone with solid fundamentals and the ability to learn quickly, often delivers more value than someone who checked every box but lacks depth. I've seen this play out where, when comparing candidates from the same security position, one candidate's resume, looked like it matched almost everything we listed. All the certifications, the tools, the right number of years. But during the interview, when we start asking scenario-based questions about how they investigate a particular alert or, what they look for in a certain type of log, their answers were superficial. They could name the tools, but they struggled to explain their thinking. Another candidate met, maybe 65% of what we posted. They were missing a couple of specific tools and one of the certifications. But when we walked through the same scenarios, they explained their reasoning. They talked about what they'd want to rule out first, what normal versus suspicious looks like, how they validate their findings. It was obvious they understood the work at a deeper level. The second candidate got the offer. And 6 months later, they were one of the strongest analysts on the team. If they had looked at that job description and decided not to apply because they didn't meet everything listed, we would have missed out on a really good hire. So how do you evaluate, whether you're actually qualified, when you don't meet everything listed? So first, start off by identifying, what the job actually requires you to do every day. Look past all the technologies and certifications. Find the sentences describing activities and responsibilities. Those tell you what the job really is. A security analyst role, might list 15 different technologies, but the actual work is investigating alerts, analyzing logs, identifying threats, documenting what you find, and communicating with other teams. That's the job. Whether you do it in Splunk or SentinelOne matters less than whether you perform those fundamental activities. When you identify the core function, ask yourself, can I do this work with reasonable onboarding? If the job requires analyzing network traffic to identify threats, and you understand TCP/IP, common protocols, and what suspicious traffic looks like, you can probably learn whatever tool they're using. You have the foundation, But if the same job requires those activities and you've never worked with networks, that's different. Your problem isn't the tool, it's missing the foundation, right? And this brings up an important distinction, right? Not all gaps carry equal weight. Trainable gaps involve specific tools or processes. You understand the concept, but lack of experience with that particular implementation. You know vulnerability management, but you haven't used Tenable. You understand infrastructure as a code, but you haven't written Terraform. Those gaps close quickly because you're not learning something new. You're just applying existing knowledge in a different context. Knowledge gaps are different. They involve missing the conceptual foundation the job actually requires. If a position requires investigating endpoint alerts, and you don't understand how operating systems work, how processes execute, or what normal system behavior looks like, you're missing foundational knowledge, right? You can't fix that with a few weeks of tool training. Be honest about which gap and which type of gaps you're facing, right? If you're looking at trainable gaps, you're probably more qualified than you actually think. If you're facing knowledge gaps in core areas, think carefully about whether this role actually matches where you are right now. Job descriptions also contain signals about what's truly required versus what would just be a nice to have. Pay attention to the language. Preferred means optional. Desired means they like it but don't expect it. Or equivalent experience signals flexibility. And when you see these types of language, the employer is telling you directly they'll consider people without those qualifications. Notice the placement too. Items listed first usually matter more. Requirements mentioned multiple times probably carry more weight than something appearing once at the bottom of a long list. Right? Look at the experience and how it's framed. 5 years of experience in security operations or equivalent, a combination of education and experience, is very different than must have 5 years of experience. One shows flexibility, the other one doesn't. So how do you decide whether to apply? Start with the core items, right? You can perform the fundamental activities the job requires. You're probably in reasonable territory. Meeting 70% of the requirements means nothing if you're missing the 3 things central to the actual work. Weight your assessment toward what matters most. If a security engineering role emphasizes automation and you have strong scripting skills but lack experience with 2 of the 5 listed security tools, you're likely viable. If that same role emphasizes those tools and have weak scripting skills, the calculation may change. Think about whether you can close your gaps quickly. If you can credibly explain how you learned what you're missing, that strengthens your position. If you meet the core requirements, understand the fundamental concepts, and you can close your trainable gaps during normal onboarding, the onboarding period itself. You're qualified enough to apply. You're not wasting anyone's time. You're giving them a chance to evaluate whether your particular mix of skills meets their needs. So when you do apply, despite maybe missing some requirements, address it strategically. Don't ignore obvious gaps and hope no one notices. Instead, acknowledge transferable skills and show you already are working on it. If the job requires Python and PowerShell, mention scripting. And emphasize your understanding of different things like log analysis, query development, investigation, workflows if you're weak in those areas. You're showing the gap is tool specific, not conceptual. Focus your application on what you bring rather than apologizing for what you lack. Lead with strengths. Address gaps honestly but briefly. So when you actually aren't qualified, this is important as well. Understanding when you are qualified enough also requires understanding when you're not. If you're missing core competencies, the fundamental knowledge required to do the job's primary activities, you're probably not ready. A security architect role requiring extensive experience designing enterprise security programs isn't appropriate if you've been working help desk for 2 years, right? If you're facing multiple knowledge gaps rather than trainable gaps, reconsider. Missing the specific tool is fine. Missing the conceptual foundation for several core requirements means the role is beyond your current level at this time. And if the position clearly expects, someone who can work independently in complex situations, and you lack that experience, recognize that some of those requirements do actually matter. There's no shame in recognizing when a position doesn't match your current capabilities. That's judgment. Apply for roles where you can succeed, not just roles that sound interesting. So job descriptions describe, ideal candidates, not minimum qualifications. When you understand that, you make better decisions about where to apply. The candidates who get hired aren't always the ones who meet every single requirement. They're often the ones who demonstrate strong fundamentals, learning ability, and the judgment to recognize when there's a reasonable match. You might be eliminating yourself from positions where you'd actually succeed. So stop treating job descriptions as a checklist. Start evaluating whether you can do the work. And here's something practical. Find a job description you've been hesitant to apply for. Identify 3 to 5 core activities it actually requires. Honestly assess whether you can perform those functions with reasonable training. If the answer is yes, write the application. And, let them decide whether your mix of skills meets their needs. Don't make that decision for them. Subscribe for more of this every week, and I'll see you in the next one.